The year is 2005. Ultimate Spider-Man was released for home consoles to critical acclaim. It quickly became known as one of the greatest superhero video games of all time. It had excellent web swinging, fun combat, great boss battles, and a timeless aesthetic. And most importantly, you could play as Venom.
Strange and powerful forces are attracting people to Pizza Hut. It's the Marvel Comics X-Men video with a mini comic book.
In the early 90s, comic books experienced an insane boost in popularity. Not only were they being represented in movies, television, and video games, but the actual books were selling like crazy. Consumers were really invested in purchasing first appearances, variant covers, special foil covers, and started treating comic books like an investment. A speculator market began to grow, as people saw how valuable issues like Amazing Fantasy 15 and Detective Comics 27 had become, and they wanted a piece of the pie. And what's this? Marvel's introducing a new character called Adam X. He might be the next Wolverine, so you gotta pick up his first appearance. Hey, this one comes with a trading card. That's actually kind of cool. Anyways, people kept buying and buying and buying, but there was a problem. None of these comic books were becoming valuable. The people that thought they could retire at 40 by selling all of their foil variants were starting to realize that these are the kind of books that turn up in the dollar bin. People panicked when they saw that oversupply, overprinting, and lack of demand started to make prices drop drastically, and before you knew it, the comics industry had a crash on their hands. A major problem with comic books in the mid-90s is that stories became more and more complex, lore got more complicated, and the expectation was to go bigger, better, and more extreme with your story arcs. Arcs like the Clone Saga or Onslaught are infamous for the overly complicated, drawn-out nature of their storytelling. Your average reader couldn't keep up and eventually lost interest. But in the year 2000, Marvel had an idea. A fresh start for new readers, the jumping on point of all jumping on points, a full-scale reboot where there is no expectation of knowing lore or the 50-plus year history of the characters. In September of 2000, Ultimate Spider-Man #1 hit shelves, and for $1.99 you could get an extra-large issue from creators Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, an exciting new writer paired with an industry veteran artist. The comic was extremely popular for reasons I will touch on later, but a big reason was its grounded story. Gone were the crossing over of 4 different Spider-Man titles for one story arc. This book stood alone. If you wanted to know what was happening to Peter Parker in Earth 1610, all you had to do was pick up the monthly issue and you'd be good to go. And the general audience of comic books had changed as well. Teenagers around this time were a lot different than the teenagers of the 60s, and wanted a story that they could relate to, written in a way that was familiar to them. Flash forward to 2004, and something I call Spider-Mania was underway. Everywhere you turned, there was Spider-Man. Spider-Man had made an ad deal with the devil because he was on backpacks, popsicles, lunchboxes. The merchandise was inescapable. The Raimi movies had started coming out in theaters, which led to a whole other sector of product tie-ins. But just as much as that version, you would see these guys. I think these renders of Spidey are more iconic than the entire comic run and video game combined. You guys remember these candy sticks? The infamous So-So Popsicle is of Ultimate Spider-Man. I think for a lot of kids that were born in the late 90s, this was Spider-Man. Soon, Spider-Man classic figures were hitting the pegs, changing the toy game. MTV came out with a really good season of TV based on the Raimi movies with innovative 3D animation, and the video games. Oh, the video games. There were a buttload of Spider-Man games released prior to the early 2000s, but with the rise of 3D gaming, players were getting brand new experiences with the character that they could only have dreamed of. There were some great Spider-Man games coming out for the PS1 at this time. It was more linear, but had some hilarious character moments.
Surf the web, surf the web.
Shut up, Brock, we don't have time.
Yo, I gotta give a shout out to the tie-in game for the first Raimi movie on the Game Boy Advance. This was one of my most played games ever, and I barely got far in it. I wasn't a very skilled gamer as a kid. I kept replaying the first few levels of this game over and over, and dude, they had a clip from the first movie in this game, but it's so low quality, bro, look at this. Anyways, when Spider-Man 2 came out, it revolutionized what a superhero video game could be. This game changed, well, the game, and blew 2004 gamers' minds. Gamers were hungry for a game that let them do what Spider-Man could actually do. They wanted to swing around and fight bad guys and deliver pizzas.
Whoa! He stole that guy's pizza!
This game was lauded as a masterpiece for its open world, fun missions, and intricate, unparalleled web swinging. Spider-Man 2 is an unbelievably influential and important and addicting game. But if you clicked on this video, you know, this video is not about that game. This video is about the game that followed, and the comic that inspired it. So back to the comics. Ultimate Spider-Man ran from 2000 to 2011 and is one of the best runs on the character ever, in my opinion. Ultimate Spider-Man is highly regarded for many things, but my favorite thing about it is the way it stays true to the character of Peter Parker in Spider-Man. In fact, not only does it stay true to the character we know and love, but I'd argue this interpretation influenced my generation more than any other on who Peter Parker is, because the writing for this version kind of seeped into every adaptation that followed. Ultimate Spider-Man boasts a bold, fresh take on the Spider-Man mythos, and that has its highs and lows, but to me the highs vastly outweigh its lows. This comic is set in the year it came out, so things are pretty modern in good and bad ways. Peter in this book is pretty brash and aggressive, but also caring and loyal to a fault. He is unhealthily self-sacrificial, which is a trait that is so true to the character. I think my favorite thing about this version of Peter is his morality, his sense of right and wrong, and his drive for justice. It sounds cliche to talk about justice when discussing a superhero, but this Peter strives to make the world he lives in a better one where if you can do the right thing, you should. And being this passionately stubborn doesn't always mean that Peter is in the right. He can sometimes come off as pretty harsh or closed-minded. Take a look at this issue. When a beloved character gets killed, Peter isn't this plucky, happy little kid that some media paints him to be. He grieves, and not only that, is he imperfect in his grief. He takes it out on his classmates and doesn't always offer them the grace that he probably should. I love that this version of Peter Parker is imperfect because that's what a hormonal teenager is. The themes of power and responsibility echo throughout this entire run, from when Peter has to learn these lessons the hard way, to when he passes on the wisdom he's gained and becomes the Uncle Ben in someone else's story. The school life is so interesting. When this book came out, centering a Spider-Man series around him in high school felt new and fresh, as for like 30 years, Peter had been a grown man and married. In the original comic, he was only in high school for like a few months, but people remember Ultimate Spider-Man and think that's how 616 always was, which is just untrue. The best parts of the book are the small character moments and the soap opera drama. I found myself looking forward to the times Peter was not Spider-Man, rather than the big action set pieces. This run tackles real-world ideas like bullying or prejudice, told through its mutant characters. Throughout the whole run, there are these characters that are consistently being harassed and tormented, just for the way they're born, and using a character like Liz Allen and deconstructing why she has this destructive worldview is pretty interesting. Peter's relationship with MJ is just as good as it's ever been, and is just so gripping throughout the entire run. Not to mention this book actually makes Gwen Stacy pretty interesting. Even if it changes some elements of her character, I'm just glad she has something to do. The book changes a lot of characters, and when done well, I really don't mind because it fits this story. And this doesn't mean that it's all just people talking the whole time. The action and superhero moments are just as good. The villains in this run are a lot different than their 616 portrayals, and are more of a mixed bag than Peter and his classmates. They tweak a lot of origin stories and connect them more directly with Peter, and adjust things so that they are more directly involved with his origin. Some are done pretty well. I personally enjoy this interpretation of Green Goblin, and the Doc Ock is different but still menacing, and Kingpin is just awesome. The characters like Kraven and Venom don't really get the all-star treatment. I'm glad they adapted the symbiote run, but it's just way too short in this book. Something I love about the writing in this run is how the story has actual stakes. Too often in modern comics, when someone dies, they just come back over and over. Since this book is its own thing, when a character dies, they pretty much stay dead. This book sold so many copies and was just begging to be adapted, and a few years into its run, it would get its best adaptation. But before we get there, I want to discuss what makes a good adaptation, and why would you want to adapt a comic book in the first place? So why adapt a comic book at all? A major reason companies like Marvel or DC want adaptations is to widen the original story's appeal. I bet 90% of the people you know have seen The Dark Knight, but how many of them have read The Long Halloween? Outside of your comic nerd friends, most likely none of them, because movies are infinitely more accessible than comics. Comic books, especially in 2024, are a niche medium. Bringing your art to a new audience is only a net positive when the adaptation is good. People also want to see a story they love in a different medium. Seeing something that has only existed on the pages of a book be animated or brought into live action is just an undeniably exciting premise. Think about books like Harry Potter. It's one of the most popular series of all time, but I guarantee a massive part of that popularity came from the books being adapted into a large franchise of films. So, we want an adaptation, but what makes an adaptation good in the first place? In my opinion, an adaptation should stick to the bones of the original work. It should stay faithful to the tone, the ideas, and the soul of the original most of the time. You shouldn't be a slave to the source material, but it's helpful to recognize what made the source successful in the first place. A good adaptation makes the art its own and brings something new to the work. Nobody wants to watch a literal one-to-one film adaptation of a book they read, because that would be boring. And not all good adaptations have to be one-to-one with the original. Look at a film like The Shining. It was rejected by Stephen King, the writer of the original book, for straying too far from the source material, but it's hailed as a masterpiece by basically everyone else. Movies like Blade Runner or The Hunchback of Notre Dame can differ greatly from the books they're based on, but no one cares because the films are amazing. You don't have to copy the source word for word, you need to make sure the audience understands the heart of the source. A good adaptation has to balance being a faithful representation of the heart of the original work, while being a good example of its new medium in its own right. Let's look at what I consider to be a good adaptation and a bad adaptation. Spider-Man 2 is a good adaptation. It adapts Amazing Fantasy number 50 as well as some early issues with Doc Ock. The film creates its own unique narrative but is centered around a beloved Spider-Man story and makes the original story work within the world the movie has created. Objectively, the Raimi trilogy isn't exactly always faithful to the source material. Peter differs greatly from his comic counterpart. They change a lot of small details like the ages of the characters and when Peter met MJ and Harry, small stuff like that, but it tries something different and is successful because it fits the story the film is trying to tell. Doc Ock is far more sympathetic than his early comic counterpart, and in my opinion, it works even better here than it did in those issues. The reason this movie is so successful is that it isn't just a good comic book movie, it's a good film. A movie I would consider a bad adaptation would be Amazing Spider-Man 2. This film adapts the night Gwen Stacy died, and not very well in my opinion. A big reason is that this story is incredibly hard to adapt, as basically everyone who knows about Spider-Man also knows that Gwen Stacy bites the dust from a big fall. The point of the original story was to shock the audience and to do something that had never been done before, and by 2014, it had been done before. The night Gwen Stacy died also serves a narrative purpose for Peter's character in the original run. It reaffirms the lessons that Uncle Ben taught him while teaching him the lesson that tragedy can strike at any time, and sometimes death can occur even if you're doing all the right things. It teaches Peter that no matter how hard you try, you can't save everyone. In the comics, Harry Osborn becomes the Green Goblin to avenge the death of his father, while the film changes it to having a health curse that is slowly killing him. This change is a bad change in my opinion because narratively it is so much less compelling than the source material. Oh, and don't forget it tries to half-adapt the storyline about Peter Parker's dead parents and fails miserably. Visually, the film is great, and Andrew Garfield is fantastic. His Peter takes a lot from the Ultimate run especially, but overall, the movie doesn't just fail as an adaptation, it fails as a film, which is the worst sin of all. So now that we know what makes an adaptation good, I want to talk about one of my all-time favorites, 2005's Ultimate Spider-Man. If you've never played Ultimate Spider-Man before and you boot it up for the first time, I think the first thing you'll be struck by is the presentation. This game looks and sounds different than most superhero games, especially nowadays, and it's refreshing. It has a consistent art style throughout, and to me, it is stunning. It holds up better almost 20 years later than most of the games of its era because unlike its peers, it isn't going for the most advanced graphics that it could possibly achieve. It invests in a timeless art style. Compared to a game from a year earlier, the legendary Spider-Man 2, it's like night and day. It doesn't look muddy with the amount of textures, it feels and looks like a moving comic book, which is pretty unique. Look at a game like The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. It holds up better than a game like Twilight Princess because it chose a cel-shaded art style, it's simpler but has better direction. And the best part is, it is adapting Mark Bagley's incredible artwork and does it wonderfully. I could not pick a better art style to be made into a 3D Spider-Man game. It was made for this. Bagley's art is probably my favorite look for Spider-Man. He's got the big eyes I love. I seriously cannot stress enough how good this art looks. Even the cover of the game is stunning. This puts any modern game cover to shame. Presentation doesn't just mean art style. The details that this game brings over from the comic are crazy. This game is so faithful to the source material, it's astounding. Every detail from the world of the comic is treated with respect and care, and I cannot stress enough how rare that is. You never see a superhero video game dedicate this much time and effort to capturing a specific art style, a specific run, or any major parts of a comic outside of Easter eggs here and there. From the onomatopoeias when Spider-Man is fighting or the use of comic fonts, there's character all over this. In this game, you get to travel between Queens and the city, with Peter's school and house from the comics being represented. Small things like how Peter has a room in his basement is even brought over, his cubicle at the Daily Bugle, and even the little line that goes through Spider-Man's lenses. This game is not ashamed to be based on a comic book in the slightest. The characters are presented pretty faithfully, some cutscenes are taken straight from the comics. This game is also hilarious, which is an element of Spider-Man comics most adaptations fail at. A lot of adaptations try to make Spider-Man funny, and he just comes off as irritating. Here he actually makes me laugh.
Hey you! Is that a rhinoceros horn, or you just have to be... Let's see... I'm so scared I can't even finish my lame joke. Hey, I know you get this all the time, but any of you see a big, scary robot guy with a backpack? I hate it when this happens, because every time this happens, something even worse happens about 2 seconds.
Peter looks and sounds like a 15-year-old kid, and it's a welcome change.
It says I'm a deformed mutant.
You're not?
And some doof calling himself Speedball is the coolest thing since the Ultimates?
And this is going to haunt you.
Yes it is.
Peter has some fun character moments here that make him really feel like the character from the book.
Peter, you need to calm...
I need to quit getting almost killed by stupid people is what I need.
The gameplay here is nothing to scoff at either. The web swinging holds up incredibly, and at times makes Spider-Man 2 on the PS5 look limiting. Web's actually attached to buildings, which at the time was only shared with Spider-Man 2. Man, it's annoying how there are two Spider-Man 2s. Like, if I just say Spider-Man 2 without a visual, you'd have no idea what game I'm talking about. Spider-Man 2. See? You have no idea. Anyway, you can do crazy things. Like, if you want to gain height, there's a button that lets you climb your web vertically, so if you're racing with the Human Torch and need to gain some height quickly, you can do that. I love that you don't let go of your web until you choose to. Letting you hang from your web as long as you want, and whatever way you want, you can literally just hang there. You can change your trajectory at will. It gives the player a ton of control. And as much as I love a game like Spider-Man PS4, the web swinging doesn't give you as much freedom as it sacrifices freedom for pretty animations. And I gotta say, I love the jump mechanic. With a regular press of the A button, you do a normal hop, but the longer you hold down A, the higher and further you go. First off, this makes you feel like Spider-Man. Secondly, this gives you a ton of control of exactly how far and how high you're able to go. You can be extremely precise and it just feels snappy. The gameplay here is actually fun. You can swing around and stop bad guys for as long as you want, and sometimes you would even come across a small-scale villain like Shocker in the Overworld, which was always so exciting. More games should do this. The races aren't my favorite, but they're not unbearable. Some of them are actually hard to do. Johnny Storm was cooking me consistently. The variety of locations you get the races in are nice, like when you're racing in Queens and you have to use the web zip far more often because the houses are so low to the ground. You can gain forward momentum even easier than upward momentum. You can just zip around and increase speed really quickly. The combat here is pretty basic. You have two attack buttons as well as your web button, so there's really only so much variety you can experience. It's definitely not bad, but coming from recent games where you have a lot of gadgets and abilities to play with, or a game like Web of Shadows that has its own fun combat mechanics, it just feels a little bland here. The boss fights range from really easy to surprisingly difficult. Some took a lot of tries for me to beat them. This game is definitely not forgiving as it goes along. If you mess up during a boss battle, a lot of the time you gotta restart from the beginning, which can be pretty frustrating. There's some cool collectibles here too. You can unlock comic covers and alternate suits, which all look fantastic. A small detail I love is that before each mission, the loading screen is a comic cover previewing the next boss battle coming up. Using this much comic artwork encourages the gamers who had never picked up a comic to maybe give one a try. More things should do this. Paying direct attribution to the comic creators you are basing your story off of should be the bare minimum, and most adaptations don't even do that much. Like Venom 3 is coming out soon, and when the trailer revealed that Null is the big bad of the film, the comic creators who made him didn't even know until they saw him in the trailer with the rest of the world. Pay the artist, man, seriously. Regardless, the story of this game is pretty light. Basically, Spider-Man fights Venom, Venom becomes targeted by multiple different parties trying to take him down, and Spider-Man fights some villains from his rogues gallery. I don't want to spoil what happens in the story specifically in case you haven't played it, but most of the actual important plot elements take place in the beginning and the end of the game. It feels like the middle chunk of the game is just a bunch of excuses to get you to fight some bad guys, but the gameplay is just so addicting that I really don't mind. There are some fun character moments here and there, and this is where the story really shines. This game works because it isn't trying to be a grand epic like Spider-Man PS4, Web of Shadows, or even Shattered Dimensions. It feels small scale not just in the storytelling, but in the open world too. It has so much character, and to me, that's what makes the game so fun to revisit all these years later. Something else the game does is bring other characters from different sides of the Marvel Universe into Spider-Man's world, like Human Torch or Wolverine, and like all the other parts of the game, these specific character choices are taken directly from the source material. If you're a fan of the game and the original comic, you are constantly rewarded. All of that sounds like a great game. Just based on everything we've discussed, this game sounds really fun and worth all the praise I'm giving it. But this game is known for one thing: Venom. This is some of the most fun you will ever have with the character of Venom. When I first heard of this game and was informed that not only was Venom one of the main characters in the game, but you got to play as Venom, I cannot stress how cool of an idea that is to a kid. And Treyarch didn't make Venom a reskin of Spidey, they really went all out. Venom's gameplay has similar elements to Spider-Man's, but operates completely differently. When fighting a lot of enemies, the best strategy for Spider-Man is to bounce around and switch between punching and kicking different enemies. And when a bad guy gets knocked down, you have to make sure you web them up so they don't get back up again. As Venom, all of this is out the window. You can still punch enemies, but now you have this tendril whip attack which gives you more range, but more importantly your web move is replaced with the ability to absorb your enemies. Venom's health is constantly slowly depleting, and the only way to gain health is to literally feed on your enemies or innocent bystanders. The first time we see this mechanic, Venom literally eats a little kid. His balloon flies away. They pull 0 punches with this Venom. He has a move where he will grab someone and snap their back in half like it's a glow stick. The way his gameplay differs from all other Spider-Man experiences is so refreshing. You have to constantly be hopping from enemy to enemy to make sure you maintain your health, which balances him out because he's unbelievably strong. If there's an enemy in your way, you can just pick them up and chuck them halfway across the map. Oh, and did I mention you can throw cars? His jump is ridiculously satisfying. If you thought Spider-Man's jump felt good, this is that on steroids. Since he can't really web swing, he jumps over tall buildings in a single bound and web zips around. And the way the ground crumbles and shakes whenever you land is so good. It gives the character a real sense of weight. Something the game does that I find really creative is that in every boss battle that you play as Venom, you are paired against a hero or villain that can also heal. It takes your biggest advantage and uses it against you and adds some nice difficulty to the fights. Character-wise, this is definitely a different take on Venom, but it really works in this story. Eddie's motivations are unique compared to most interpretations, as he doesn't feel quite as personally linked to Peter's story. One of my favorite versions of Venom is from Spectacular Spider-Man. In that show, Eddie Brock starts off as a big part of Peter's life as a human and childhood friend, and when he bonds with the symbiote, he starts to infest and attack every aspect of his life. This Eddie Brock is spiteful, malicious, and determined to make Peter Parker's life a living hell. Ultimate's Eddie Brock shares a similar origin as Spectacular Spider-Man, which is actually based on the Ultimate comic book, but he diverges when he's actually Venom. In this story, Venom spends more time working with Trask and fighting other supervillains than he does trying to get revenge on Peter Parker. Throughout the game, depending on what character you're playing as, you have a different story to follow, which is fun on its own, but when the stories intersect is when the game gets really interesting. When playing the game and I had to switch back and forth, I never really found myself getting annoyed that I had to switch back to Spider-Man, as his gameplay is really fun, but man, there's just something intoxicating about running around New York City as a ravaging symbiote. Playing as Venom in a game like Spider-Man 2 is explosive and some of the most fun in the entire game, but it's only for one mission, so you can barely compare them. However, both games nail the sense of untamed power you should feel when controlling a symbiote. Even in a game like Web of Shadows, when you play as Peter in the black suit, the gameplay shifts and makes you feel much more powerful and your attacks become much more destructive. The developers knocked everything Venom related out of the park. This game has made its mark on me and is wonderful, but it's not perfect. The biggest critique against this game is its length. It's just too short. You could beat this game in a day, which to be honest sucks, but even that feels like a compliment to the game. It's such a good game that I just want more of it. It's short and sweet, but I wish the story was a bit meatier. A big problem with the game for me is its jankiness. The camera can get unfathomably annoying. I never fully got used to it and it felt pretty restrictive. It tries to do a lock-on system for boss fights, which is appreciated, but it never really felt good to me. And the boss fights are a mixed bag in their own right. Some are fun, but a lot of them ended up feeling tedious, especially the chases. Some bosses' health felt unnecessarily padded. The fights aren't bad, but they could have been better. And the visuals could really glitch for me at times, with a lot of pop-in with the buildings that would consistently clip into each other. Actually, that might just be the way I played it and recorded footage. You know what? Let's go find out.
What's going on, guys? We got my copy of Ultimate Spider-Man here. We're gonna test it on the GameCube, see how the building pop-in actually looks. So, let's do it.
Okay, so the pop-in and glitches are really bad. But it takes forever to get to the visuals because the loading screens are so long. It just feels like they take forever every time they pop up. Lastly, some of the gameplay formula could just be repetitive. The gameplay loop of complete city goals, swing around, story mission, complete city goals, swing around, story mission, just got to feel a little tiring by the end. I would have loved a little more variety in the missions or random crimes. Even just let me deliver pizzas, just give me more stuff to do. I think modern Spidey games have so much more side content, whether it's catching pigeons or solving, albeit lame, puzzles. I always feel like there is something to do in recent games. But please do not get me wrong. These are some real complaints, but they do not bring down the game that much. The good here is just so good. Fun gameplay, memorable characters, and great cutscenes make Ultimate Spider-Man shape up to be a pretty fantastic experience. I love this game, and I loved playing it again for this video. As time goes on and games get bigger while simultaneously feeling more shallow, smaller scale stories with a lot of love and care are what I gravitate more towards these days. It's funny, holds up visually, and most importantly, the gameplay is tremendous. It captures the heart and personality of the original comic in a way that most adaptations don't even care to attempt. If you've never played Ultimate Spider-Man before and are a fan of the character, you've got to pick this game up and give it a try. I would love for a remake or re-release, but with Sony owning the rights to make Spider-Man games and Activision being the original publisher, it seems very unlikely. Reminds me of another thing we should get more of but is tangled up in rights issues. Either way, this game is an achievement and essential for any comic fan's game library. I got to reread the comic and replay the game for this video, which was such a blast. Thank you so much to everyone who's been supporting my recent videos, it really means a ton. And let me know, what is your favorite non-Insomniac Spider-Man game? For me, I'd probably say Ultimate Spider-Man or Web of Shadows, but there are no wrong answers. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.